Hi, it's me, Space Explorer, and today I'll be explaining what it would take to bring an uncrewed Starship to Mars' surface and back to Earth. It's my first actual documentary, so please bear with me as I'll be going in depth on this topic. As of right now, Starship SN8 is almost ready to or did its 15-kilometer flight test with the belly flop landing. This is crucial to land on Mars as Starship is designed to shed most of its speed using the Martian atmosphere thanks to its wing. SpaceX is developing its Starship/Super Heavy booster at a breathtaking speed. They might have a shot at landing a Starship on Mars on the next launch window in 2023, but I suspect they would focus on the Starship Moonlander, as it will help them fund Starship as well. They will also be using it to send a lot more Starlink satellites into orbit, as Starship could launch over 400 Starlink satellites at a time. In this video, I'll be assuming a lot of things like the weight of the equipment, whether or not they're suitable on Mars, the power requirement, the fuel needed for the trip back, and much more. I'll try to stick with the most accurate information I could find and leave my source in the description down below. With that said, let's begin. First thing first, we need to get the Starship into low Earth orbit using the full stack of Super Heavy and the Starship. Starship can only get to low Earth orbit when full of cargo. Then we need to get some fuel from other Starship tankers using on-orbit refueling like shown in this animation. We'll need to have about 10 tanker refuels to max out our fuel tanks. Once this is complete, we will be able to get into an escape trajectory. One thing is clear, Starship is still in heavy development and we barely have no details on the amount of fuel a Starship tanker variant can hold. I'll be assuming roughly 10 tanker refuels for Starship with about 100 tons of cargo to be fully refueled in order to leave to Mars. But those numbers could change drastically through the development phase. With that said, we know based on Elon Musk's Twitter feed that a fully fueled Starship in a highly elliptical orbit at full cargo capacity has about 6.9 kilometers per second of delta V. Delta V stands for change in velocity. It's basically by how much we can change the velocity of our spacecraft. We also know that we need about 3.9 kilometers per second of delta V for a Mars transfer injection, using a standard low energy Hohmann transfer of about 9 months travel time. That leaves us with roughly 3 kilometers per second of delta V. We assume that Starship will do a mid-course maneuver to fine-tune its approach to Mars. But this burn should be very insignificant and might cost roughly 50 to 100 meters per second of delta V. We also have to consider an important factor here, called fuel boil-off, due to the cryogenic temperatures of our fuel and the temperature of Starship facing the sun due to the sun heating effect. This effect would boil off that really cold gas that we have. SpaceX could mitigate this problem with a double-wall stainless steel cryogenic tank with vacuum in between the two tanks and coated with a highly reflective paint to reduce fuel boil-off by about 99.9%. The 0.1% of the heat that does enter the system has to be gotten rid of using a cryo cooler that operates below the boiling point of the propellant. Of course, using this would add a significant amount of weight on Starship, thus reducing the total delta V that we have available. From now, we'll just assume that SpaceX will use all the fuel available to leave the Earth at a much faster speed and reach Mars within 3 to 6 months, using all the available delta V, since we'll be losing all of that fuel to boil off, except the header tanks, which are used for the landing either on Mars or back to Earth. For reference, header tanks are smaller fuel tanks located inside the main tanks, which are isolated from fuel boil-off. Based on the current design, Starship will not perform any orbital insertion at Mars. Starship will do what is called aerobraking. Aerobraking is a spaceflight maneuver that reduces the speed of the spacecraft by using the drag of an atmosphere and its aerodynamic surfaces, say its wings, to reduce our velocity enough to enter the atmosphere and reach our landing location. The landing location is currently unknown, but we have this satellite image of Mars from NASA that shows the depth of water on Mars. We're not sure on the amount of water available on Mars, but a robotic mission could check this before we send any crew or ships. This is crucial for Starship design that is based on In-Situ Resource Utilization, which means that we need to refuel our ship using available resources on Mars. Starship will be entering the Martian atmosphere at about 20,000 kilometers per hour and will be bleeding off all of that velocity using its aerodynamic surfaces and heat shield tiles. After a few minutes, Starship will reach terminal velocity, which is the maximum velocity attainable by an object as it falls through the air. Starship needs about 230 meters per second of delta V, which is what the header tanks were designed for. Based on the most recent SpaceX simulation, Starship will be falling at about 70 meters per second and will consume fuel from the header tanks to perform the final landing. They use those tanks only for landing, otherwise landing with nearly empty fuel tanks will have slushing effect, and when that happens, the turbo pump would pump air bubbles and could severely damage the engine, thus experiencing a catastrophic failure. The final landing phase is known as the belly flop landing, as you can see in this animation. It uses its wings to bleed off most of its speed, and once it reaches terminal velocity, it lights up the engine and flips over. This technique helps save fuel needed for landing by as much as possible. We've now finally landed on Mars, intact with our 100-ton payload. We have to set up our base and start taking the equipment out of Starship. Right now we know that Starship will have an elevator to bring down the equipment. The equipment will have to fit within the small area of the elevator and has a weight limit, otherwise the Starship could tip over. This should take from days to weeks to fully bring everything down, either with humans or robotically. I'll be assuming that robots will perform those tasks, as no humans will be on board during the first few flights. The first thing we need for our Mars Alpha base is the power production plant. Power production is crucial for mission success. I'll use current technology based on the available information I could find. We'll need enough power to keep Starship system active considering the day-night cycles, the atmospheric effect, the refueling system, the electrolysis, the cooling, and the comm system. I am assuming a roughly 10 megawatt capacity to get a daily average of 1.5 megawatt before atmospheric and accumulated dust. The total power requirement to refuel one Starship per transfer window is probably around 1 megawatt for 600 days. For reference, a transfer window is also known as a synod, which is the next time Mars and Earth are close enough to launch and go back to Earth. Now let's talk about the solar panels, because we'll need a lot of them to meet our energy requirement. A company called Philsum promotes two interesting products: E-rolls at 0.2 kilograms per meter squared and 100 megawatt per meter squared. These solar array at the 10 megawatt capacity would mass in at about 20 tons. These are still 3 times as heavy as the lightest possible array, allowing for durable protective coating. These might be the best option for Mars right now, as they offer a protective layer needed for Mars. The other option is called E-film. E-film is at 0.06 kilogram per meter squared and power is up to 2 kilowatt per kilogram. These would mass in at just 5 tons for a 10 megawatt power station. For perspective, it's the same weight as printer paper. I'm not assuming they'll ever be used, but they could be useful as part of a special layer used for the In-Situ Resource Utilization dump mass. I know they might never be used in the Martian environment, but I thought it would be good to mention them anyway. Furthermore, there is mounting hardware to consider. It might involve grading the surface depending on the landing location, but I'll include this in the total payload as well, since we need some support for our solar panels. Wiring and some other tools might also be needed. The solar string would probably run at a fairly high voltage, so the cabling doesn't need to be that heavy. But the equipment for power conditioning and conversion, charge controller, DC converters, for example, might be significant. This is hard to estimate without a full design of the power grid, but a majority of the power goes to the electrolysis cell, and the more direct a connection is, the less mass is needed for power conversion and regulation. We do at least know that the grid would be DC, as Elon Musk has stated as much, and it makes sense. This means that the inverters and rectifiers are not needed. So in total, the solar panel mass should be at about 20 tons, and the mounting, power conversion, and tools would be at about 5 tons. I'm being optimistic but not unrealistic. Now that we have energy production going, let's move on to the day-night energy storage. For storing energy, lithium-ion batteries seems the most plausible idea because Elon Musk owns Tesla and is already used on both Starship and the most recent Mars rover. Looking back at the Mars rovers, one of them spent 13 years and the Curiosity rovers over 1500 Martian sols. For reference, a Martian sol is roughly 25.5 hours or so. It's the equivalent of a day on Mars. I currently have no details of the next generation Tesla batteries that could potentially be used on Mars, so I'll assume a mix of hydrogen cells and batteries, since fuel cells offers a decent power density. I know Elon Musk said hydrogen are the fuel cells.
I don't want to turn this into a debate on hydrogen fuel cells because I just think that they're extremely silly.
There are two things to consider: the power required at night and the energy needed to keep all the systems going at night. We need from 100 kilowatt to 400 kilowatt, and it would be needed for about 14 hours when the sun is not high in the sky, but I'll give it some slack and use about 16 hours for extra margin. The minimum storage could be provided with a few Tesla power packs, which would provide an ample 400 kilowatt of power output. Then those batteries would need to have heaters for the cold environment of Mars. We'll also need rectifiers and cooling system. Although batteries are probably not the best option, but they're good for power conditioning, helping maintain a stable voltage through spikes when the loads are mismatched. Then we might need hydrogen fuel cells. I found some aerospace grade cells rated at about 1800 watt at 975 grams. To get the desired power of 100 kilowatt, this would require 54 kilograms of those cells. In theory, hydrogen provides 24 kilowatt hour per kilogram, so we need storage for hydrogen. To recap, our energy storage need will be about 10 tons worth of batteries if optimized and about 2 tons for hydrogen fuel cells. Plus we'll need storage of hydrogen and oxygen while considering the tools, wiring and everything in between for power storage for about 24 hours. Of course, if the power needs to grow, SpaceX will send more Starship with supplies to expand our Mars Alpha base. This is a rough estimate, of course, as we're just making a rough draft of what is needed for a single Starship to fly back to home. It would be safe to assume that some power generation would be required during a severe dust storm. I think it's reasonable to say that about 5% of solar energy would remain even during the dust storms. Propellant production would be shut down to conserve power for essential functions. Note that the backup power is mostly here to provide redundancy for the crewed base mission than for the sake of the propellant production itself. However, it is closely tied to the propellant plant as energy storage in hydrocarbon presents one of the only viable medium-term energy storage options during storms. I will assume that 50 kilowatt is needed, but 100 kilowatt is desirable to continue power workshops and lab to the humans that aren't just sitting on their hands. But this will not be needed for this first mission. The total power generation including solar should be about 200 kilowatt for redundancy. Probably no power generation is needed during the day, but there might not be enough solar to provide daytime needs and to recharge the batteries. In the last severe dust storm, there will still be enough solar power to run all the essentials, and having to resort to non-solar might be something that only happens for a few weeks, once a decade. This deserves closer examination, but we do know that solar-powered Opportunity rover survived nearly 15 years on Mars before there was a dust storm severe enough to end its life. During a dust storm, the battery-powered vehicle would be kept plugged into the grid, both to save the power the vehicle would otherwise be using, and to contribute their battery capacity to the grid, eliminating the reliance on hydrogen fuel cells when little solar power is available for electrolysis. For severe dust storms, there are four main options I can conceive of. The first one would be a 10 kilowatt nuclear power unit. However, I don't think this would ever be used as it involves way too much bureaucracy and politics shenanigans. The second one would be steam reforming of methane to hydrogen for use in hydrogen fuel cells. The third option would be an internal combustion engine generator using methalox turbines. And finally, the wind turbines. If the cryocoolers needed to keep the methalox cold is offline, it will start to boil off. If it does so at a rate of 0.1% per day, that would provide 240 kilograms of methane and oxygen per day. This could be used to generate about 55 kilowatts of electricity using a methalox generator. Better off using the fuel than losing it, right? As a side note, the propellant plant produces about 400 kilograms of methane a day. So when we have 1 day of clear sky, we have about 1.6 days worth of emergency power from the methane boil off. Then we'll need a generator to use this excess fuel during those harsh times. A 60 kilowatt hour generator tends to mass in at about 1 ton. An internal combustion generator, whether diesel or turbine, might need special cooling strategy due to the high methalox flame temperature. This would probably involve using compressed Martian atmosphere as the diluent and or film cooling of turbine blades. The propellant plant would provide a compressed atmosphere anyway. The best aerospace grade generators would be significantly lighter than these examples, possibly around 200 kilograms for a 60 kilowatt generator, although a heat exchanger for combined heat and power would be desirable. Overall, the fuel cells and generators seems quite comparable in terms of mass, being a few hundred kilograms. In the future, methane fuel cells will likely be a superior option, but right now they still have most of the downside a gas turbine has when operating at high temperature. And it would seem desirable to use equipment designed for reliable, standby emergency generation during dust storms on Mars. Wind turbine ought to be able to produce a significant amount of power, although turbines capable of doing so would produce no power during non-storms. I found this lightweight wind turbine. A 30 meters per second wind on Mars would be the equivalent of an 8 meters per second wind on Earth. And this turbine would thus produce 160 watt, and it weighs about 20 kilograms. The specific power is 8 watt per kilogram. That is much worse than the 60 to 200 watt per kilogram for an internal combustion generator. And it seems unlikely that even the robustification could make it competitive. Still, plausibly, 50 kilowatt of backup power could be provided by 6 tons of wind turbine. It's not so terrible as to be beyond consideration. In fact, it feels worthwhile bringing a few turbines just to see how well they perform, or using them to power remote monitoring stations during dust storm. So to recap our power backup needs, we'll need 2 60 kilowatt gas turbines that weighs in at about 1 ton. We'll need 10 kilowatt of wind turbines that weighs in about 1 ton as well. And we'll need fuel cells plus steam reforming equipment, so that weighs in a few hundred kilograms. So we'll be at about roughly 2.5 tons. Another important factor to consider is the water extraction, crucial for refueling Starship. We need to feed our electrolyzer to make both the hydrogen used for methane production and the oxygen needed to refill the oxygen tanks. Starship has about 1,200 tons worth of fuel. NASA already has a good idea of where most of the water on Mars is located. See this image. There are 2 proposed strategies for extracting water on Mars, which would be most effective. First would be digging up chunks of icy regolith and baking it, and secondly, using a Rod's well. See the image here to understand the concept. Water extraction is really important to bring any Starship back home, just as important as power generation. About 600 tons of water would be required for producing the propellant to refuel a single Starship, but it would be safe to assume double of that to account for future Martian. But on the first mission, it won't be necessary to go over 600 tons. This would require an extraction rate of 1.3 kilograms per minute or 22 grams per second. At this rate, it would take a few minutes to fill a 3-liter bottle. Melting this much ice would require 10 kilowatt of heat input, which is roughly 1% of the total propellant plant requirement. Waste heat could be used for this. Maintaining the rod well requires more heat due to the losses into the surrounding ice. Long, isolated, electrically heatable pipes would probably be used to circulate water between the propellant plant and the Roswell, serving to deliver waste heat. Based on a NASA study, the Roswell would require about 50 kilowatts worth of power. Some water would be needed to start up a Roswell. This might be extracted with the assistance of electrically heating element that is lowered into the ice, or perhaps a prior robotic mission or a drilling robot. The water might be purified by vaporization, with the vapor being recondensed by heat exchange with the incoming water if needed. This vaporization would require roughly 55 kilowatt, but waste heat can be easily used for this as the water/steam is mostly needed where the waste heat is generated. There are many different types of small rig that could be used that masses between 150 kilograms and 500 kilograms, which would likely provide ample diameter and depth of about 50 to 100 meters. It doesn't seem that water extraction would be a major fraction of the mass. Even a small man portable rig seems capable enough, though it would probably be desirable to robotize the rig to some extent. The equipment, including borehole casing, could also be made very lightweight. PVC is often used, which is pretty light. So in total for water extraction, we'll need about 2 tons worth of mini drilling robots, 2 tons worth of pipes, and let's throw in an extra ton or 2 for extra materials that we'll need to do the Roswell in the first place. Another major component will inevitably be the electrolysis tank. The number we have to fill a Starship is 240 tons of methane and 860 tons of liquid oxygen. The combination is known as methalox. Electrolysis tank, for those of you who doesn't know, is basically taking water, add an electrode in it, induce an electric current, and it separates the hydrogen and the oxygen. We need the hydrogen to combine with CO2 that could be extracted from the Martian atmosphere to make methane through the Sabatier process. Right now we'll assume daytime only refueling, mining, and electrolysis operation, as we need the power to maintain primary Starship system online through the nights. The majority of power would go to the cryo coolers to keep our fuel chilled, so something like 2 or 3 megawatt of electrolysis capacity would be required. This electrolyzer from the company Hydrogenic seems surprisingly lightweight, but they're not giving details of the mass. The energy input of 3 megawatt and produces 1300 kilograms per day of methane. This fits perfectly in our design. I'll assume 1-2 ton of weight for the electrolyzer stack. It will also be necessary to provide hydrogen storage for Mars Alpha Bay. The cells would need to produce 260 kilograms per day of hydrogen. If it were desired to have a 16 hours worth of storage for the night, that would require a 1-ton hydrogen tank using a 1:8 ratio. Using the same machine, this would produce 2300 kilograms per day of oxygen, which might be immediately cryo-cooled. So the electrolyzer stack total mass should be about 4 to 5 tons. We'll need 2 tons for the electrolyzer itself, 1 ton for hydrogen storage, and we might need 1 ton for oxygen storage unless we use the Starship itself. The reactor will need to generate about 400 kilograms of methane per day and needs to take in hydrogen and carbon dioxide at elevated pressure. Fortunately, electrolysis produces high pressure hydrogen after being re-expanded from liquid, so getting the input into the reactor is pretty much opening some valves. The reactor outputs methane, water vapor, and potentially unreacted carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The methane has to be separated and purified as required. Mass estimates are tough for the reactor itself. I've seen studies ranging between 250 kilograms to about 700 kilograms for the weight of the reactor, producing roughly 500 kilograms per day of methane. So I'll call my reactor 1 ton just for extra redundancy. Last but not least are the coolers responsible for taking the hot methane from the Sabatier reactors and the hot oxygen from the electrolysis stack and chilling it to about minus 160 Celsius for the methane and minus 180 Celsius for the oxygen. The coolers are responsible for preventing the escape boil-off either by deep chilling the propellant or through the boil-off reliquefaction. In total, about 1800 kilograms of methane and oxygen will need to be liquefied per day, and perhaps about half that in boil-off. Also, a considerable mass of CO2 needs to be liquefied. However, the CO2 needs to be heated before entering the Sabatier reactor and could exchange heat with methane ready to enter the coolers. Mars is a really cold place, suitable for cooling things. On Earth, heat often has to be discarded at around 25 degrees Celsius. On the other hand, at Mars it's extremely cold at night and it can be as low as minus 130 degrees Celsius. During the day there is significant heat load from direct and indirect sunlight, and the atmosphere can be warmer, but convective heat transfer is very low and the heat transfer is still dominated by radiation. If the panels are not exposed direct to the sun, they would still be reasonably cold even during the day. The cryocoolers are one of the major components I'm least certain about. It's not even clear if we should run them only during the day or to run them day and night. It would require less mass when taking advantage of cold nighttime temperatures to better utilize the radiators. So I conclude that 3 tons might be a reasonable mass for all the cryocoolers. We may not see the first Starship on Mars with the ground pre-prepared for a base, but the first ship would build the foundation for it. I'm assuming grading and rolling as a way to prepare the surface for many hectares of rollout solar blankets. It seems logical to bring several mini electric excavator that would be fully autonomous, because I can't conceive someone driving this in a bulky spacesuit. Having a bunch of tiny robots that are capable of bringing stuff out of the cargo bay and preparing everything autonomously is really important. There are those that may object that these mini excavators are too small. However, the challenge of building a base on Mars is not that it's a huge construction project. It's actually a relatively small job relative to construction project on Earth, and there's a lot of time to complete it. The challenge is that it has to be done on Mars. It would be harder to get large, heavier vehicles out of the cargo hold, and there would be less redundancy than with a bunch of small vehicles. I'm estimating that with 3 mini excavator, they would weigh in at about 6 tons and roughly 2 tons of attachment for a total of 8 tons for the Earth working equipment. Then there's all the other stuff like cables, mounting brackets, accessway, protective packaging, cranes and lift, trailers and sled, insulation, MLI tents to protect equipment during severe storm, insulating pipes to pump methalox between Starship, extra food, and so on. It's not exactly clear how much of this stuff will be needed. Clearly, solar panels, wind turbines, radiators, vehicles, and water extraction equipment have to be deployed outside. Other than that, the propellant plant could be integrated into the cargo bay of the Starship. If SpaceX is fully committed not to returning that Starship, which seems to be the case for early Starships, it could be almost entirely unpacked and deployed in surface buildings to consolidate the propellant plant equipment from multiple ships into a single complex. Surface buildings, for instance, would require a fair amount of extra mass, so let's call this about 10 tons of extra materials for redundancy. So to conclude, the final number I came up with is 74 tons. Let's add it all into a chart. Solar power equipment, 25 tons. Electrolysis stack, 4 tons. Day-night energy storage, 7 tons. Water extracting equipment, about 4 tons. Earth moving, 8 tons. Backup power, 2 tons. Cooling, 7 tons. Atmospheric extraction, 3 tons. The Sabatier reactor, about 1 ton. And the cryocoolers, 3 tons. And let's add roughly 10 tons for the extra materials, for a total of 74 tons or so. Working on the assumption that Starship can land 100 tons on Mars, that would easily fit within the payload capacity with some leftover for more redundancy. This would mean that 2 Starships can land each with a complete propellant plant, which in an ideal world can fully refuel a single Starship every 26 months. That means that if everything goes well, 2 Starships could be returned at the next launch window. Coming into this exercise, I assumed the propellant plant equipment would be much heavier. Many components turned out to be much lighter than I expected, like the solar panels, the water extraction, the electrolyzer, and the power storage, and everything else in between. One surprising conclusion: if a Starship can land 150 tons, they could carry enough hardware to refuel 2 Starships per transfer window. Digging into this topic took me literally weeks to do, and I really hope you guys enjoyed learning as much as I did learning all about this. SpaceX Starship will truly be revolutionary, and I can't wait to watch the prototypes fly and do more testing than the previous one until we finally become a spacefaring civilization, and when the day comes where we launch humans to the moon, Mars, and beyond. SpaceX is truly pushing the limits of what humans can do, and I'm really thankful to everyone working at SpaceX and the Starship program. Without them, we might still be stuck in low Earth orbit for a long time. This was a lot of hard work, so please hit like, hit subscribe, and leave your comments and questions down below. I really need your feedback and questions, so don't hesitate to give me more ideas for future videos. Until then, I'll see you all next time, and thank you.